regional chief, Poitras is our chair, and what the issue was that there was no space for the inherent title and rights speakers to be on the agenda, and our committee did send that off to the AFN office, and did actually discuss it at the last meeting over a month ago, and then our recent meeting. Unfortunately, there wasn't any changes they could make to the agenda, so they made a space for me here. But I'd like to say I always continually have to create that space, and I acknowledge, the Yukon speaker that also acknowledged it's been a long outstanding issue for Canada. So here's the information that I have here. The first one is that, with the inherent entitlement rights, we're outside of the existing modern treaties, and we actually have our sovereign-based identities with our land. And in 1910, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, our ancestral chiefs, identified that we don't interfere with the colonial laws, and the colonial laws don't interfere with us. It was based on coexistence, but it was based on our natural laws, our creators' laws, whatever you want to call them, our Secwepemc laws, and Canada still hasn't respected that. Some of the nations are pursuing other avenues in regard to modern treaty, but many of our nations and the people, most importantly, who hold the collective proper title holders are our people that collectively hold that title, are outside of that process. And it's being dealt with through bans and the engagement with the government. So it's divisive in many ways, and I think we are identifying that, how we're all affected in that regard. And then I think it's Quebec and BC as well that are affected that way. So when Canada is talking about overhauling their 4 policies, we actually say 5 because the physical policies also impacted through self-government. Is the willful, consistent upholding, parsing out of that information, which we heard many of the chiefs speak about, has resulted in a piecemeal and exclusionary process of engagement with First Nations that is characterized by in sufficient time frame and inadequate representation. We heard now what Minister Carolyn Bennett saying. It still isn't clear. They said they're going to take down the comprehensive claims and the inherent right to self-government off the website, but not cleared. Do you mean you're still not repealing it? And also, the other issues with the directive, which I'll get to shortly. So there has been nothing in writing about the repealing of those 2 policies. And I think we should be asking for that, as some of the chiefs have. And also, she mentioned about providing a negotiating directive, and the question is, how does that adhere to the United Nations Declaration? And she also added that it also will be applied to the ministry, in doing their business. So this is, we don't know how all this is being developed, and again, how can that be consistent with the United Nations Declaration if it doesn't include those nations who will be affected that are outside those processes. And free, prior, informed consent, as many of you know about that clause in the United Nations Declaration, even though we're asking Canada to uphold it, our organizations and our own nations should be upholding it as well. And in our process of BC, many of our communities or nations are outside of the BCTC process. Our union represents over 110 First Nations in BC, and we haven't been at those processes. We did meet with Joe Wild in October, who didn't relinquish much information. Then he met with us very briefly, I think less than 3 weeks ago or something like that. And still, we said, hold it, we just heard all this stuff is rolling out, where's the information, where's the process? Because it really should be the federal government, providing us that information. That's what I was saying, the divisive approach that they're doing. And then they hired consultants that will be talking to our nations outside of the modern treaty process, but who is from a treaty community And also, many of our nations do not wish to talk to, that consultant. So there is, I think we probably would be most likely letters to that effect, but also we've had letters go into Joe Wild and Minister Bennett in regard to those processes they're setting up. And I know they hired Tom Isaac as well, who's been very vocal against the United Nations Declaration, and I think that's it's not being consistent on how, if we're trying to implement the United Nations Declaration, then they hire someone who's actually opposing it. So the engagement to reform the four policies are subject to deadlines arbitrarily set by the federal government, and that, as I mentioned, it doesn't provide adequate information on how these policy reforms may affect the exercise of title of rights outside of the treaty or those processes. And I want to really emphasize this, because even though our people came in here and maybe it would have been saying a lot of the similar things as the chiefs are saying, but their federal government whole overall approach hasn't been conducive to consensus building cooperation among our nations. So I have to underscore that. And also, it's really been unacceptable to negotiate the rights policy for those inside the BCTC process in isolation, without through those outside of the BC Treaty process who have our rights directly affected. And that's what I'm speaking on here today. And if the rights of those inside the process are unilaterally recognized, the rights of those outside the process stand to be extinguished in the case of shared and overlaps. And that's what our Grand Chief Stewart was talking about. I was trying to get Minister Bennett, and we call him Wild Joe, because I don't know if it's because we're in the West, but anyway, Wild Joe. And then, I had a chance to talk to Cheryl too, trying to explain they carry on with their modern treaty processes, and they do their settlement lands and land selection and all of that. But it's not through a process that affects the ones outside the process. It's still alienation of those lands, and it's still extinguishment of those lands to us. And I don't know if that's what the federal government is getting. And I did get my back up a little bit, because Nisha can be pretty calm, but when she mentioned the Northern Secwepemc one, she talked about that, but it hasn't been consulted or consented of all of our people in Secwepemc Nation, our proper title holders who are our people. And then, that the land selection there's nothing been consulted with overall, so I think that's the important point to underscore. And I don't know, since a lot of the communities here, might not know those facts, I wanted to be able to share them with you. And then we put a call out to be able to meet with Wild Joe, and also follow up those issues, and also internally inside of BC. So the process may result in a number of foreseeable risks, including the diminishment or prejudice to a more transformational proposal for law and policy reform. The second one is the deference that may be provided by courts or to policies portrayed as outcomes or so-called co-development. And third, the potential for interim policy measures to become more permanent than presently intended, because we've seen that happen in the past as a result of a change in the federal government. So those are some of the impacts that could be foreseeable. And Canada cannot unilaterally impose a process on First Nations that clearly impact our inherent title and rights. We have not provided our consent to. The AFN is an organization, and we heard that this morning, cannot be used by the government to manufacture that consent for this inadequate process. And the government, which we're underscoring to both Minister Bennett, Trudeau, and Wild Joe, the government needs to engage directly with the nation and the proper title holders, collectively the people. And the question we had is, how is the government intending to engage those nations on these processes? I got just a couple more points here. So, as I mentioned, our Union BC Indian chiefs were never approached by Canada to participate in a rights recognition discussion for BC. It was only, after that meeting with Wild Joe, we received an invitation, but it was too late to get a mandate from our Chiefs Council, which is coming up in June, and so there would be a fairly good discussion then. And it was not part of the, it was not a part of the other tables in BC with the summit or the BC treaty process. So we asked to see the draft policy that was mentioned. I did talk to Cheryl about that. We've heard about it, but we haven't seen anything. And that's another, I view it as, another one of the federal's divisive approaches and policy that squarely say that, the government's creating that. And again, I just want to underscore that Canada cannot negotiate a recognition rights policy with those only in those processes. This is not in line with the United Nations Declaration or free prior informed consent, because those of us outside of the BCTC process, we have our rights and title extinguished if a nation inside the BCTC starts claiming to our territory, which is actually happening to our territory, and then having their rights recognized in government policy, and then ours isn't. So it really brings you back to the square again, which is recognition of our inherent title and rights and the outstanding issue of that in Canada. Because through the policies and legislations that I've seen there, they identify the modern treaty processes, they identify the comprehensive self-government, but what is happening is we're being identified as non-governing bands through the mechanisms of the establishments of bands, and that doesn't address that outstanding inherent title and rights issue. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It was a gap in the overall Assembly of First Nations agenda. I did raise it at our AFN Chiefs Committee on Lands, Territory and Resources. All the chiefs were recognizing that and supported that we should have that in the agenda, but unfortunately it wasn't able to be changed. And I'm hoping in moving in the future, because I always remind the government and even the United Nations about this issue, because we filed many documents to the United Nations in regard to this violation, and also to Canada, every time they're talking about it, because it seems like they're always brushed off the table, or the information isn't provided to us. There was lots of information that hasn't been transparent, and it hasn't been nor timely. It's after the fact. Maybe if we do get something, but that's the information. And I hear the last two speakers were saying, we got to work together. We got to, identify some of these key issues, how we're moving forward. But I don't want to lose the process of the ones that are outside of these processes too. But Canada is continually dividing us, and we have to be able to see that as well. But I just wanted to just add in closing then, with the issues in regard to the four policies, even though Minister Bennett is saying that we're not going to repeal them now, we're just going to have a directive. I really think they're going to continue working on them. And so we will continue our mobilization, and we will continue, our efforts right up until, ironically, June 21st, Aboriginal Day. And that was just the start yesterday. So, and I really support the Treaty 1 to 11, the treaty hosts here, and their chiefs that I stood with the other day, and I really see, the sovereignty of their treaties, their international treaties, and I really appreciated hearing what they had to say earlier today. And I think that's some of the discussions and clarity, and the kind of unity and support that we need in moving these outstanding land rights, but also the recognition of the treaties. I see that as a problem too. With the last two speakers, there's still issues even within the process, and there's issues with the ones outside of the process. So that's my most diplomatic, and that's my most calm report I can give you, trying to shed light so you can try to understand where our people are coming from. I came over with our Secwepemc elders and people's delegation. I don't know if they're still in the room, if they could sort of stand up and acknowledge themselves. Our Secwepemc delegation. There was, I think, up to about 25. There's still some here. Thank you, delegation, for all your work and Secwepemc, because we've been fighting this for a long, long time, and I'm always reminded by our pipe carriers, our knowledge keepers, and our language speakers. The foundation is the recognition of our title and rights and upholding our inherent circumventing laws, legal orders, and jurisdiction. And we have to be able to do that, and we've never wanted to, you know, our ancestors never wanted to go through that process with Canada because it's all about domestication a lot of times and adhering to their provincial and federal laws, which is problematic for us. And so they have to make that true space on recognition, not just the flowery words on reconciliation. Okay, thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and look forward to some concluding remarks and questions.